Everyone, thanks for tuning into the series Let's Build a Band App. In this series, we will work through building an application to support the needs of DIY bands. We'll start out solving some basic problems and move into more complex ground, eventually transforming the application into a platform that others can use and build upon. We'll try to solve some basic kind of DIY band challenges, like managing their shows, their events, and posters and kind of details around each event, managing their recorded catalog, as well as merch, shirts and stickers and stuff, and managing like their touring schedule and things like that. We'll kind of work through some of these things that bands have to deal with. And I'll primarily be using Loopback to drive this series, at the very least from the start, in terms of like building out an API-driven application and platform. So we'll focus a lot on Loopback, at the very least through the first few episodes. And there's also a corresponding workshop as well as a code repository that you can follow along in. We're also publishing this out as articles on a couple of publications, so you can find more information there. So what I wanted to do today is to get us started by going over what Loopback is, and maybe doing a quick demo to kind of show you how fast and powerful Loopback is, how awesome it is, and then we'll take a look at what the prerequisites are, and then we'll take a moment to start to dive into it a little bit deeper. The first part we'll kind of do a really fast overview, and then we'll dive a little further into initializing your first Loopback application. So yeah, let's get right into it, shall we? All right, so what is Loopback? Loopback is an open source framework to rapidly build RESTful APIs in Node.js. It has a command line interface, a CLI, that you can use to scaffold your application and build out your API layer based on your data, essentially like a model-driven approach. And it's super fast and super easy to use and to get started with, but also to work with in general. And it's also robust and extensible. It's built on top of Express, so it has a widely used and battle-tested foundation. I want to give you a quick demo of Loopback, and I want you to see how fast and powerful it is. So I want to describe what I'm going to do and then do it without talking too much while I'm doing it, so you can see how it goes along. So what I'm going to do is initialize a Loopback application. It'll ask me a little bit about the application. The command line tool will have a series of prompts that ask me what I want to call the application, what directory I want to put it in, what version of the library, Loopback library framework I want to use. And then it will scaffold out the Loopback application with some files to have a Loopback server, essentially, including a package.json file, and it runs npm install on that package.json, and then I will quickly scaffold out a RESTful endpoint. And we'll do a cats demo, of course. And so we'll have a cat model, and it'll ask me a little bit about the model endpoint, and then it'll ask me about the data specifically, what properties my data will have. and then I'll jump into the Swagger Explorer, the UI interface for interacting with the API endpoint. And I'll also mention that the starting point that I'll use, which is one of the options that the prompts ask you for the Loopback application, is the API server endpoint or API server foundation. And that will give us a pre-configured user model, and we'll kind of see that in the Swagger UI. I'll show that really quickly as well. So without further ado, let me jump into that and kind of plow through building out a CATS API very quickly for you. All right, so let's get right into it. I will initialize a loopback application by calling lb in my terminal here. It asks me what I want to name the application and the name of the directory that I want to build it out in. I will use the latest version of Loopback, and as I mentioned before, I'll use the API server starting point, which includes the local user auth model built in, pre-configured. So what it's done here is scaffolded a number of files here to basically have a Loopback server, a basic Loopback server started for me. That includes a package JSON file, which has all of my dependencies listed out, and it has run npm install to download all of those dependencies. So what I'll do now is cd into my cats directory and say lb model to start building out my first model-driven API endpoint, which is a cat model. I'll use the in-memory data store. It's a persisted base model as the base class, the persisted model. We'll expose it via the REST API. We don't need a custom plural. I'll use a common model for both client and server. And then it starts to ask me about my data properties. So the first one is a name, which is a string. It is required, and I'll leave it blank for default. And then I'll say is friendly, which of course is a Boolean. It is not required, and I will say false for insurance purposes. Now, if I run my Node application, it outputs a couple of URLs here. The second one is to the UI Explorer. And then you'll see here we have, based on those few prompts, an entire RESTful API set of API endpoints. That includes a post, which I can try out here, say fluffy, and I can post that. We'll see the response body and my response code. And now if I go up to my get, I can try that out, and there is my data. So I am off to the races here with my cat endpoint. As I mentioned before, this comes pre-configured with the user base class. And that's very useful for building out user-based roles in your application, like members or whatnot. And there are a lot of handy endpoints here that come for free, like change password, log in, log out, reset password, a number of things here. So that's my quick demo of Loopback. We've got a cat API up and running rather quickly. Okay, so what are our prerequisites for Loopback? The first thing that we need is Node.js, and this is the download page for Node.js, the platform for running JavaScript outside of the browser. And with Node.js comes npm, the Node Package Manager, and you'll use the Node Package Manager to install Loopback. And so that's really all you need to get started is Node and the Loopback CLI, and you're off to the races. All right, so you're still with me here, right? That's the quick demo of Loopback, and I just built out a cat application, a cat API, very quickly to just kind of show you what Loopback looks like and how it works. We're gonna transition now into building our band application. Obviously, we're not building a cat application. There are sometimes cats and bands, like Bill the Cat from Bloom County, but let's switch gears now. I feel like I'm talking really quickly, have been talking really fast, been plowing through the stuff, so I'm going to take a moment and meditate and calm down, and I'm going to come back and put on my announcer voice and walk you through initializing our band application. Stay right there. Let's initialize our Loopback application, and we can do so by going into our terminal and typing lb or lb app, and this will invoke the Loopback Generator. The generator will go through a series of prompts to scaffold our application. So let's get started. The first prompt, it asks us, what's the name of our application? I'm going to call it Band App. And then it asks us, what is the name of the directory that we would like to build out this application into? By default, it assumes that you would like to create a directory with the same name as your application. If you wanted to build this application in the current working directory, you could type period, or if you preferred, you could type some other directory name there, and it would create that directory. We're going to choose the default option here and have Loopback create a directory for us with the same name as the application, as you see there. And then it has also traversed into that directory to start building out the application. The next question is which version of Loopback we would like to use. The current version is 3.x. If for some reason you needed to do something in 2.x, you could. That is still on long-term support. And 4.x is in active development, and we expect it to be released sometime later this year. The next prompt is asking us where we would like to begin building our application. Like, what sort of foundation do we want to start from? The first choice, and the one that I typically use, is the API server option. And that gives you a basic Loopback API server with the local user auth model pre-configured for you. Another option is a simple empty Loopback API server without any pre-configured models or data sources. You could also choose a hello world starting point, which gives you some basic functionality. Or you could choose the notes application option, which gives you even more functionality and is more of a basic working example to see how Loopback functions. As I said, I typically choose the API server option because I do like to take advantage of that user model. We can extend that later for any sort of user role we may have in our application for members or what have you. So now Loopback has scaffolded our application with our files to run Loopback, and it's also created a package JSON and has run npm install. And at this point, npm is retrieving all of our external dependencies. This sometimes takes a moment depending on your internet connection, but don't be alarmed by the many modules that it installs. To reduce duplication of effort, Node.js has a large ecosystem of many small modules, and npm, the Node package manager, handles these modules in a smart and efficient manner. Once the installation of these external modules is complete, we'll see a listing of these modules in this tree structure, as you can see the tail of there. And then Loopback gives us some handy next steps to get us started. And so you would typically traverse into the directory you need to work in, and then start to build out your first model-driven API endpoint, which we will get to in the next video. All right, so we're just getting started. We've initialized our Loopback application. Previously, earlier in the video, we kind of got a handle on how Loopback kind of works, at least from a getting started perspective. We're going to wrap things up here, and in the next episode, we will dive into actually building out our endpoint, our first endpoint, where we will manage events for our DIY bands. And we'll dig a little deeper into how that works, and we'll continue on. So yeah, this is the first episode, just getting things rolling. Stay tuned.